Make sure that I hit record again and get everything going. I think it's 6:32. We'll go ahead and get rolling. If anyone shows up late, I will be sure to admit them. But welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to another webinar. We got a good crowd in here tonight. It's always good to see people's faces again that I haven't seen in a while, and it's always great to welcome new faces that haven't been on one of these webinars before. I'll be the first one to tell you, we're not trying to save the world. We're just trying to have a good time and talk photography and teach a little photography. And all this is supposed to be fun, so I try to make it fun. And so that kind of springboards to my composition case studies tonight. Well, by the way, if you don't know me, I'm Russell Graves. I'm coming to you from Hackberry Farm in Dodge City, Texas. Beautiful day out today. Been a beautiful day for the past few days. The weather's finally warming up. The wildflowers are starting to bloom, and it's been dry. I mean, I tell people this all the time and they don't believe it, but when you live in this little corner of Northeast Texas, it's as rainy here as what it is in Seattle, Washington. And it seemed like the sun never shone for probably from about mid-November till about almost the first week of April. We finally started getting some sunshine. And so it's good to see the sunshine. Good to be out in it all day. I was out in it. My 85-year-old dad was working me like a rented mule today. We were building fence, or he was having me build fence, and so we had a good time together today. So I'm glad everybody's here. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to be upfront with you on a couple things as we go through this, and it's if you've ever been around me before, you've heard me say this before, but if you haven't heard one of these webinars, it might be a little bit groundbreaking. But one of the things I always try to teach people is composition. It's really pretty simple. It's arrangement of the subjects in a photo, whatever that subject is. One thing I like teaching is when you're taking a picture of something, you decide who's the star of your show. And it's going to be like any movie you watch. You're either going to have one central star to the movie, or you'll have an ensemble cast. And if it's an ensemble cast, how do you arrange that cast of characters on screen at one time where everyone gets their due in terms of, the picture you're trying to take? And so one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is, I'm just going to show you some pictures I took. May not be the greatest pictures I've ever took. It may not be the worst, the best pictures. I mean, the worst pictures I've ever taken. I usually try not to show people the worst pictures I take, but these are pretty nice pictures in my opinion, but they help illustrate the points I'm going to try to make today. And one of the things I want to really work on doing is demystifying composition and really just trying to make it accessible to everybody. The thing about composition, people call them, there's certain rules, and here's the point I'm going to make, where if you've been around me before, I like to keep things pretty simple. If you've never been around me before, when I talk about composition, even with this one, the one rule of photography that can be complicated, I like to keep it pretty simple. There is no shortage of videos on YouTube and the internet to talk about complex compositions and all these different things you've got to think about from a really analytical point of view, or more from sort of a scholarly point of view. But I don't think that way. I think in pretty simplistic terms. I see the world in pictures when I think about the world. And so when I think about things like composition, I'm not really trying to dumb it down. I just try to simplify it for myself, because that's how I learned photography. I make it akin to when my children were trying to learn to walk when they were babies. I didn't set them down and have a deep conversation with them about things like gravity and inertia and the way all the bones have to fit together in their legs to make mechanical motion so they can move across the room. We just said, hey, you stand up and it all sort of works together and you figure it out from there. And that's what I think about composition too. I mean, we can get someone's doing closed captioning. I'd like to hear how closed captioning interprets my Texas accent, because Siri and I have even Alexa and I have a long history of not agreeing with one another, because they don't do a good job of understanding my Texas accent. So hopefully whoever turned on closed captioning, good luck with that. So I'll try to speak as clearly as I can so that the closed captioning can understand me. But anyway, back to composition. When I'm teaching composition in the field, or I'm talking about on this webinar, I really try to make it pretty simple. And I make it pretty simple because when I'm out in the field and I'm thinking about how to compose an image, I like to keep those thoughts short and simple and not overthink it. I mean, y'all, you can pick any subject you want to, and you may have done it before. I know certainly I've done it before on other subjects, but it's possible just to overthink things. And so from a photography standpoint, I try to encourage people, don't overthink it, just kind of go with it. And going with it means sort of following these, and I put them in quotes, rules, because every rule is made to be broken to some degree. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things I'll look at, and then we're going to get into looking at some real world pictures. I tell everybody the rule of thirds is a good place to start. That's a tried and true compositional method. And usually when I'm trying to figure out a new composition, particularly on landscape photography, because if a wild turkey walks up, I can compose it without even thinking about it. It's muscle memory. Landscape photography, a lot of times if you're presented with the scene, I have to kind of study it a little bit and think about it. And I think that's sort of the gist of landscape photography anyway, is it's more of a studied composition than necessarily wildlife photography is. But I'm going to show you both examples tonight, wildlife and landscape. But usually with landscape photography and even wildlife photography, it becomes muscle memory over time. I start with the rule of thirds. It's a good place to start. If you don't know what rule of thirds is and you're brand new to photography, I'll explain that here in a little bit with some slides here in a little while. And so simple shapes tend to guide my compositional choices. And when I had that epiphany a while back, I started looking at my pictures. And when you look at my pictures tonight, you'll be able to see these simple shapes like triangles and curves guide the way I see the world, and the way I try to line up pictures in addition to the rule of thirds. But once I've got the rule of thirds established, I start looking for triangles and curves in the picture and try to accentuate those shapes. And then one thing too, and I've always shot this way. I've always shot both verticals and horizontals and tried different compositions, but it kind of surprises me the number of people, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing at all. It's just people's tendency, but it surprises me when I'm teaching workshops how many people just want to stick with a horizontal format. And I think a lot of that has to do with social media has kind of guided that, because vertical pictures don't work very well on Facebook. I think they crop better for Instagram verticals, but as far as Facebook, they don't. So I think that kind of guides people's compositional choices. But I'm always a fan of just using kind of the old school rules of composition, the rule of thirds, and sort of letting that be my guide. And so I shoot verticals in addition to horizontals. I was telling this to some people yesterday too. One of the biggest mistakes I think I see people make when they're doing photography from, because I'm teaching this. If you read the newsletter, you may know I've got this educational series going on here at the farm called the Nature Photography Academy. And we just had a meeting yesterday. And so a couple of weeks ago, I did a webinar with those class attendants. And I asked them, the question is, where do you feel like your weak link is? What do you need help with? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Because I want to try to guide everything we do based on what you think you need and things are going to help you the most. And almost everybody said composition. That's what they need help with. And so when I asked them to send pictures, one of the things I noticed is their compositions aren't bad, but their choice of time of day when they're taking the pictures is what suffered the most, because they look at the pictures like, well, the composition is not that great. Well, the composition was actually pretty good, but they were shooting at 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning when the light is typically the worst. And so I was showing them some examples that I took there's a state park here in Texas called Monaghan Sand Dune State Park. And if you think of White Sands, New Mexico, it's kind of like that place, just miles and miles of sand dunes, except they're not white. They're more of a sandy color, tan color. And I was showing them some pictures I took in the 11 o'clock in the morning that just looked unimpactful. And then I showed them a picture that I took in the morning of almost the same scene and how much better that picture looked. So good light always helps a lot. And good light is a Band-Aid that helps mask sometimes less than stellar composition. Another thing I use to back up this notion too is I've judged literally thousands of pictures in my, well, really probably over the past 10 years, maybe tens of thousands of pictures I've judged. And I can tell you that from a compositional standpoint, that's what people, that's where it usually gets people, is the composition may not be terrible, but the poor light really doesn't let the whole scene shine like it should. And by the way, as we go through this, if if this, I want this to be a dialogue and not a monologue. It's hard for me to read chats. I notice I've got a message in the chat right now because I've got to click around and get to the chat, but I'll get to the chats at the end. But if you have any questions, anyone who's listening live, and you might want to turn your mic on if you have a question, just feel free to ask me a question as we go through, because I want to make sure that I explain what I'm talking about completely, because I am I've got my wife tells me this all the time, because I'm a man, sometimes I don't explain myself clearly. And so because of that, if I'm not explaining myself clearly, please feel free to ask. And so another thing that I encourage people to do is give the scene and the animal, or if it's a landscape, purely a landscape, give the scene. And if it's an animal, particularly, give it some room to breathe in the frame. A lot of times people will take pictures that are so close, and we were looking at some of this yesterday, that you'll have an animal close to you, for example, and your tendency is to take a horizontal. Well, when you crowd that animal in the frame, it tends to be a sort of a clumsy composition. Sometimes if an animal's too close, I'll switch to vertical, because just the vertical and the extra room above the animal, and I'll show you some examples, kind of gives that a little bit of room to breathe. And then even in the scene, I'll tend to shoot a little bit loose, just to give and not crowd any elements necessarily, just to give it some room to breathe. And then take a variety of compositions. You've heard me say this before. The thing I love about digital photography, it's like going to a casino, which I'm not a gambler, so I'm talking about this in theory. It's like going to a casino and playing slot machines, but the casino's letting you use their money. Take lots of pictures. It's not going to hurt. It's not, you'll have a few more to download. It might take a little time when you're done, but you might find that gem of a better composition if you kind of move around. Steve Rubin, I'm going to pick on you. I remember we were at a stream side in Smoky Mountain National Park last October, and we were looking at different compositions. And I said, let's just try to move around a little bit. And you did, and you finally found the one. I remember that. I don't know if you remember that or not, but I certainly do.
And I remember it's hanging up right to my left.
Yeah. And sometimes when you move around and take a variety of compositions, it's subtle. You move a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, back up a little bit, move forward a little bit. It's not like you have to relocate yourself to the next county. A lot of times it's just moving a couple of feet over, one way or another. I was illustrating that in the academy yesterday. Our topic yesterday was macro, and we were shooting pictures of flowers, and there was a flower that was in good sunlight, but if the guy moved, but it had a background that was lit the same tonality as the flower was. And so if the guy moved 2 feet to the left, which I showed him to do, all of a sudden he's against a shadow background. And then our star of the show, the flower, all of a sudden looks like, because you've got a dark background, because the background ultimately wasn't an important part of the composition. All of a sudden, because the flower is against the dark background, it makes it stand out more. It puts the star of the show in a little more of a spotlight. So that's what I mean by take a variety of compositions. Just feel free to move around. I do this a lot. I study other people's work. I try, and that's how I learned photography. When I was a teenager, I would look at the first magazine I remember that kind of influenced my photography, and you can see it today if you look at some of those old issues of Sports Illustrated, where they'd have someone like Dwight Gooden of the New York Mets, or Roger Clemens of the Boston Red Sox, or Nolan Ryan of the Texas Rangers. They'd have one of those guys throwing a fastball, and especially in wildlife photography, you can see this. And one of the first techniques I taught myself was, I love the way on those pictures in Sports Illustrated, how like Nolan Ryan would be in focus, but the whole background would just be really blurry and out of focus. And that look I loved. And so I started trying to deconstruct how that was done and teach myself that. Well, I do the same thing. Even today, I'll study other people's works and really try to look for some of the things I'll share with you, like the triangles and curves, and see how they implement those in photos. And that way I can take away some lessons for myself, because photography, I had a lawyer friend of mine tell me that the reason why they call it practicing law is because you never perfect it. And so I think for me, it's practicing photography, because I've said it before and I'll say it again. the greatest golfers in the world, Masters were just over last weekend. The greatest golfers in the world play the game knowing they'll never play it perfectly, but it's the pursuit of perfection that makes it interesting. I think the same thing's true of photography. And so I study other people's work, try to get better every day, try to learn new techniques every day, and just commit to being better at it over time. And sometimes I fail, sometimes I don't, sometimes I succeed, but I at least like trying over and over and trying to learn from my mistakes. And always think about what you're doing and try to pre-visualize a shot. You know, this comes with muscle memory as well as, or visual memory, or, you know, you get to a point and people in the audience you absolutely know what I'm talking about if you've gotten to this point in your photographic career where you can look at a scene and you can just visualize how each of your lenses will see that scene, and it makes it easier to go figure out what lens you need. And so one thing I try to encourage people to do is think about what you're shooting and then pre-visualize those shots, so that way when it comes time, it's ready. You know, I'm going to the Smoky Mountains again on Friday, teaching a workshop there next week, and I will go scout on Saturday. And while I'm scouting, I'm pre-visualizing, you know, what's this scene going to look like? If I bring a group of 7 people here, is this going to be worth our while? Can we get some good compositions out of this? And so I'm always pre-visualizing, and I'm pre-visualizing too, thinking if that bear steps out from behind that tree, am I ready to go? And do I have the equipment I need to do that? So I'm constantly thinking about that kind of stuff. And then I call it the Kenny Rogers rule of photography. Sometimes you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And every now and then you find a composition that no matter how hard you try, you just can't figure it out. And I've certainly had those things too. You know, the easy ones, if you go, I see Carol's in the audience. Carol, we've been to the Tetons together. If you go to have we been to the Tetons together? If you go to, yeah, you've been on that trip. If you go to the Tetons, you go to Schwabacher's Landing. And so you've got this beaver pond and you got these big trees and you've got the mountains in the background. I take people there because that's an easy composition to figure out. You look at it and it's easy to figure out who the star of the show is and who are the supporting characters and how they should all be arranged, because the landscape just gives it to you right there. It's so easy to figure out. But every now and then you get to a spot and it's just hard. You got to look around and every now and then you find something that, you know, no matter how hard you try, you can't make a good composition of it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't take the picture, but it may not be that stellar shot that you're looking for. And, you know, at some point you need to give yourself permission that that's a fact of life and it's a fact of photography. And sometimes you got to know when to fold them, said the late Kenny Rogers. So as we go through these, I'm going to show you some real world examples. These are just pretty pictures that I'll talk about, some of which I'll talk about later. And you'll start seeing as I talk about these 3 basic composition, or these 2 basic composition rules, really I talked about, because remember, I like to keep things simple. I try to use the rule of thirds and I try to implement shapes in the picture when I can. And I'm going to talk through some of these and tell you about them. So here we go. By the way, again, if anyone has any questions as we go through this, you know, and even if it's, hey, where'd you take that picture? Feel free to speak up and just let me know that. Sometimes I'll tell you like this one where I shot the picture. I've driven by the scene many times. This is actually in the Texas Panhandle, about 25 miles from where I used to live. It's right off of Highway 287. It's near a town called Memphis, Texas. And it's in this old farmhouse sitting out in this cotton field. I'd passed by it many times and knew there was a picture there, but most of the time I was passing by and it was, you know, middle of the day, and I'd look out there and I knew something was there, but it didn't really make sense to me. And then one morning I had to go to Amarillo, Texas, which is about 120 miles from where I lived. And I left early in the morning and I hit Memphis about the time the sun was coming up. So remember my lesson from earlier? I said that good light makes a huge difference in the way the picture looks. When the sun's coming up from the east to the left and shown across these furrows, and all of a sudden it gives the picture a lot of texture and gives you those leading lines and makes things a lot more interesting. That's the day I stopped and took the picture. But this picture in its basic form follows the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a simple, I call it a tic-tac-toe grid, because that's easy for beginners to understand. If you lay an imaginary tic-tac-toe grid over your picture, the rule of thirds says wherever the lines intersect is where the emphasis ought to be. And so this is really working the rule of thirds in two ways. And this is where the rules are made to be broken, or they're made to be stretched a little bit too. And that is, I adjusted the horizon where it's closer to the upper third. And then the main star of the show was this old farmhouse. And so with these two lines intersect, it's where I chose to place that subject as well. And so early on, and I didn't draw it in here to show you, but early on, people call these leading lines, and leading lines are certainly important. I call them shapes because, again, like I said earlier, I see the world in pictures, and these shapes, you see the curve in there, and that's part of an S. And so that's one of the shapes I see all the time. So use the rule of thirds, use the S, and let those lines kind of guide you and guide the scene. And over time, it becomes kind of second nature to you if you do it enough. And so again, using the rule of thirds in two ways to guide where my horizon is, and then to guide where the placement of the building is. That's what sort of dictates it. Now, I could have put the building on the other thirds, but my thinking here is the sun's coming from the left, and that concept, you got to give the image room to breathe. And so the air is sort of coming into this picture, so to speak. The air, so to speak, is coming in from the left on this picture. So that's why I chose to move the building to the right. And so, but I looked at it every way when I was there. I looked at it with the building on the right, looked at the building on the left. I shot some horizontals of this, some verticals of this, just to try to play with it. But in the end, this one ended up being my favorite of all the pictures. And this is really, if you've ever been out to that part of Texas, this is one of those pictures that where you've heard the old saying that a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, if you're familiar with that part of Texas, this picture speaks volumes to you, because it's indicative of that mesa country. You can see the mesas out there, and it's really indicative of one of the few places in the country that's depopulating, because the Great Plains of the United States for the past 50 or 60 years have been depopulating. The populations are declining. And so you'll go out to the countryside and find a lot of abandoned farmsteads. And because of farm consolidation, where the farms back in the day, y'all, if you study history very much at all, certainly you've heard the old saying where people used to be given 40 acres and a mule. And because back then you could make a living for a family off 40 acres, farming 40 acres. But now, because the equipment, inputs, and all the other costs of doing business to be a farmer is so expensive, you got to have more and more land just to make it make sense. And so farm consolidation happened. People moved to town, or they left the area altogether. And so you have this. And so that's why this tells it was worth 1,000 words in this regard. And this is almost the mirror image of the last one, but sort of in reverse. Instead of being in the upper right, the star of the show, this yucca, is in the lower left, and you can see there and these are uncropped, by the way. So these is how they came out of the camera. I downloaded these, or I exported these from Lightroom probably an hour ago, well, a little more than an hour ago, and put them in this presentation. But just to show you here, and again, so we've got the yucca where the lines intersect. But even though, well, let me go back. Well, let me tell you this, and I'll go back. Even though this upper line kind of dictates approximately where the horizon is going to be, it doesn't have to be anchored to that, because the one thing that makes me try to figure out how much sky to include is how interesting the sky is. On this one, I really like the blue sky, but it's the most uninteresting part. So I chose to have more land, less sky. Same way with this picture too. The sky was interesting up to a point, but you can see here most of the colors in the bottom of the sky. But if you get right to those top clouds, they just become gray and boring. And so it was a compositional choice I made to include less sky and more land, because I thought the sand dunes and the mountains far in the distance were far more interesting than the sky. And so I chose to, when we look at the rule of thirds, that's why I chose what to do on there. And then here's the interesting one. Steve Rubin was with me when we found this shot. This is in the Smoky Mountain National Park. I've included this picture a lot in the webinars lately, but this is where sometimes the rule of thirds applies here, because roughly the swirl, I composed this picture. We were kind of limited how we could take this picture, but I don't know why those little stars are right there. I guess I accidentally put them in there. But we we kind of had some limitations where we shot this picture just because there's a big rock sort of jutting out. If you go towards the waterfall, you're going to get wet. If you step backwards, you're going to fall to a certain depth about 10 feet behind you. So there's had some limitations, but along that rock, we could definitely compose how we wanted to. So as we looked at the shot, this composition seemed to make more sense instead of looking straight on at it, because you can imagine the tic-tac-toe grid there. I'm not gonna redraw it on there, but this thing I talked about earlier, triangles, that had a strong triangle element to it. And so when I look for triangles in a composition, that's one place I do it there. And again, I'm gonna state this again. This is how simple I think. Rule of thirds, and are there any triangles or curves I can include in the composition? That's a 3-step process I do every time I try to do a picture, see a landscape picture, and how I compose it. You can get into the theories of the Fibonacci, I think it's called the Fibonacci circle or square or whatever that's called. And you can dive deep from an artistic standpoint into compositions and why you do those. But I try not to get that complicated in my thinking, because from a teacher standpoint and a teaching standpoint, the photography education industrial complex sees no money in keeping things simple. And I like to keep things simple because we all learn, like I said about my children when I was teaching them how to walk, they just need simple instructions on learning how to walk. If they want to get into the weeds later on as they've conquered walking, they do. But if I was to bog them down with all the complexities of how people walk when they're a year old, they would have been so frustrated, then they would learn how to walk. And I think the same thing's true about photography. If I would have, and I see it in people, if I'd have taken the time to try to learn all the things I was doing wrong or all the things I wasn't thinking about when I was a young photographer, it would have overwhelmed me, and I would have given it up a long time ago. And I see it in people where they get frustrated because there's too much information, and sometimes they watch too many YouTube videos, and too much information confuses you over time. So that's why I always opt. It's good to keep things simple. You can remember simple, you can learn from simple, and then you can take the more complicated at your own pace. With that said, and I'm done preaching on that part, even this picture, I had plenty of compositional choices in this one, and this one uses those 2 simple rules. You ought to be able to see the rule of thirds as I've laid it out for you, and you ought to be able to see a clear shape in this picture the way I composed it. Can anybody know what the clear shape is? It's a triangle, another one. And so again, if you lay an imaginary tic-tac-toe grid on there, you can see the 2 compositional things I look for. I think the rule of thirds is a good way to start and try to figure out where the elements in the picture ought to be. But I think when you start looking for those curves or those S shapes and triangles in a picture, that's what adds the pop and the dynamic to the picture in the end. Same way here. Rule of thirds, you can clearly see where I put the elk where the third of the lines intersect. I gave the elk room to breathe because it's and I'll go back on that one because I forgot to mention it. This is a big mule deer in the Texas Panhandle. I gave it room to breathe because, as a rule of thumb, whatever direction this deer is moving from left to right. And so if I'd have put the deer on the right hand side of the frame, it would have been too crowded against the edge of the frame. So I've got to give it room to breathe. I'm going to give it more space to the right of it, or the direction in which it's moving. Same way with the elk here. It wasn't moving. It was just bugling on this hilltop, but I put myself in a position where I could get that strong graphical element. You can clearly see with the horizon and the ground, there's a triangle there. And then the rule of thirds is in play. And then of course the elk's looking to the camera left. And so that's where I gave it room to breathe, is looking to the camera left. Makes sense to everybody so far? I'd like to overcomplicate it from that, but it's really, that's as simply as I think about it. And so if anyone has any comments as I go through, feel free to shout those out. And if you think I'm wrong on something, feel free to shout that out as well, because I don't, Lord knows I don't know everything there is to know about photography. I'm a student like the rest of you guys, and I'm always apt to learn something new.
I never heard
This thing,
that
this,
triangle concept. Boy, that's powerful. Yeah.
Oh,
Russell, can
thank you,
you hear
Don.
me?
I can. I don't know who I'm talking to, but I can hear you.
John Richards.
Hey, John.
On that elk picture, I always kind of struggle, your diagonal line, how far up or down to make that go. In other words, how much sky to put in. A lot of times that's determined by other stuff that's in the picture you don't want in the picture.
Correct.
But what's your feeling like if you had that go up, so the elk was on the upper third, or is it better in the lower third, or what's your gut feeling?
Well, my gut feeling when I took the picture, because a lot of times with wildlife, I'll just go with the gut feeling. And that's where I talked about earlier that with landscape, I have to study it a little more, but with wildlife, I've got a pretty good instinct of how I think it'll look. So my thought here was pretty simple because I remember this was at the National Elk Refuge, north of Missoula, Montana, between Missoula and I can't remember the next town to the north. Flathead Lake is to the north of there, Missoula's to the south. This National Bison Refuge is right in the middle of them. And so this elk was there. And so the weather was changing and these clouds were really rolling and the sun was starting to go down. And I remember I was in a pickup with a friend of mine. I got out of the truck and moved to the left. And when I composed this, to me, as opposed to the other pictures I showed you, the landscape shots, the most uninteresting part of this, because it was going to be a silhouette, was the ground in front of me. And so the least interesting part was the ground. The most interesting part was the sky and the texture of the clouds in the sky. So I made a snap judgment to try to get this shot while he was bugling to include more sky as opposed to more ground. And so usually if it depends what's more interesting. Obviously, if I can go back to my movie reference that I talk about so much, if the elk is the star of my show, the sky and the ground are supporting characters. And so it's on this scene, who would I want to showcase more? We're going to see the elk, but do I want to show more sky? Is it given more to the picture or is it the ground? And I chose the sky in this regard because I just thought the sky was a lot more interesting than just the dark ground. Now, again, that doesn't always apply. I don't have any in this presentation, but I've got pictures where I shot more from a design element, a silhouette where you've got a lot more ground and less sky, but usually those design elements get inserted into like if I'm working on a magazine or a book project and I need sort of a picture where they're going to place words on top of, that kind of drives my design element in. But on this one, it's just as simple as the sky was more interesting. Does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, that answers it very well. And I agree with what you're saying on that.
Yeah.
The sky is actually quite interesting.
And so this is another picture of a waterfall in the Smoky Mountain National Park. It goes back to what I was saying about, I shot this two ways. I shot it vertically and horizontally. I thought the vertical worked better, but you can really look at this picture two ways, and I actually had to move out into the stream to get this shot, to get this composition, because I thought it looked better. But obviously you can kind of see the rule of thirds influence on this. This is where I broke the rule a little bit, because if you can imagine this break in the rocks is like a horizon line between the rocks and the trees behind it. I played with the composition where I had the horizon line further up and you just had uninteresting water at your feet. And then I moved the horizon line further down. Well, then you had uninteresting trees and then a glaring sky above that. So this is where it doesn't fit the rule of thirds perfectly, but the rule of thirds is where I started. But you can look at this shape in one of two ways. You can look at it as a series of S curves, or it's also, if you start really paying attention, it's just a series of triangles. And this is a scene where I talked about I studied for a while, because when I first walked up to it, it's a beautiful waterfall, but as I look, it really doesn't speak to me in terms of what looks best. And so I just kept moving over and over and over and shooting two different compositions and came up with that. And then same way here, this one's obviously with water. It's hard to look for me. It's hard to look for triangles in water. So when I talk about S curves, that's usually when you're talking about some sort of flowing water moving towards you. But so this is kind of S curves, but this is also another good example that works a lot with, and I don't have a way to draw this on here. I don't think, oh, I do. Hang on just one second. Can y'all see this? on my screen? Can y'all see what I'm drawing on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, well, good. I just figured, see, I learned something new. There's also a triangle in there on how that composition is laid out. And over time, as you start, it becomes easier for me over time because I'm looking for those specific shapes in a picture. Because I think it tends to lead the eye, like this one tends to lead the eye up the stream. So you've got a combination of, you know, all three: rule of thirds, some S curves, as well as a triangle. And that's what I saw in that picture. Oops. Close that out. There we go. You know, one of the things I've been working on for the past couple of years is trying to be better at macro photography. And one of the new lenses I've found, I've mentioned it briefly in the past, if you've been on some of these webinars, is I was judging a photo contest, and you might have seen the picture. I saw one picture in that contest 2 years or almost 2 years ago, year and a half ago, when I judged it, that I became enamored by. And when I judge these contests, I don't know who takes the pictures, and because they strip all the metadata out, you just look at a picture. But there was a picture, and you may have seen this because it won some big like international wildlife photography award last year. But it was of a ball of honeybees, and that's what they do to protect the queen, I think, is the behavior. But it was a ball of honeybees, but it was a wide angle shot. So the camera was you could tell it from the picture, was just an inch or two away from the bees, but you could see the landscape behind it. And I started trying to figure out, it looked like a wide angle macro to me. Well, I found there is a wide angle macro, and it's made by a company called, the one I found was made by a company called, I think Laowa is how you pronounce it. It's Laowa. And in that, I started really using that to sort of see macro differently. I take my share of really, really tight close-up pictures, but I also love the look of that. Kind of do macro landscapes is what I call it. Who knows what it's called, but that's just a simple name I came up with it. But even when I've started shooting those, the one thing that attracts me is to have a central flower in front and then let the landscape sort of fall away from it to lead your eye to the out of focus point. And so in other words, you got a central point that when you look at the picture, you look at it, and then over time, the eye kind of draws it away, and you start seeing those simple shapes again that I try to look for in pictures to improve the composition. And in this case, it's another triangle. So, and I don't know if anybody in the audience is cynical and thinking, well, it's pretty easy to go back and play Monday morning quarterback and figure out those shapes. But I can assure you that when I go out and take pictures, that's what I'm looking for. So that's what I wanted to try to demystify tonight in these compositional case studies. So to John's point earlier, this is a similar picture of the elk. This was from Chobe River, Botswana, June of 2022. And this particular shot, this particular spot, I wanted to, the elephant, we were in a boat, an elephant swam the river right in front of us, and then got up on the shore on this island in the middle of the river. And I got ready, I put on a 16mm lens and shot this silhouette. Well, I had a couple of choices here. I could either include a lot of sky or a lot of ground, and the ground was really, really kind of busy because you can see it's sort of ragged here. So this is where I broke the rule of thirds. It's basically rule of thirds, where the elephant's over on the right. It's got room to, it's got room to move into. The animal has room to breathe, but I included more sky in the picture than anything. And of all the elephant pictures I took last year, and believe me, I took thousands of them, this is probably about my favorite one that I took. I'm going to look at the chat right quick. So we've got some chats building up. Karen Agner is the one who did take that picture. Ed, that's astute, because I actually was on the phone with her about a week ago. We had a good long conversation about wildlife photography. But she's absolutely, I found out after the fact, and I found out when that picture won that big award because I saw it on the blog and thought, I've seen that picture before. And so, talking to her, and I brought the picture up, and that's how she took it. Was with that wide angle macro.
Russell, what do you think about extension tubes for macro?
So we did that macro workshop yesterday here at the farm, and I'm a fan of them. I mean, that's really kind of what I recommend people's first entry into macro is our extension tubes. Cause I think you can buy a set of extension tubes, which they come and you can find them in sets of 2 or 3. But the ones I have are Canon brand, and there's a 12 millimeter and I think a 24 millimeter will give you a lot of extension. But it'll turn, if you don't know what extension tube is, it'll turn like a 70 to 200 millimeter lens that may only focus 4.5 feet away. You can put extension tubes on it, which extension tubes look like a teleconverter, but there's no glass in the middle. It's just an empty hole. And when you put those extension tubes, I'm no optical physicist, but I can tell you it makes that lens focus a lot closer, and it works great with flowers and other things as well. And in learning and trying to learn a new technique, one of the things I figured out is I'm going to step back a little bit because I just noticed when I lean that way, that sun's pretty bright on me. One of the things I figured out over the weekend is if you add those extension tubes to a dedicated macro lens, you get really, really like 3x and 5x magnification capabilities. And if I can, I don't have it on my desktop anymore. And while the new technique I was trying to teach myself was, a lot of y'all have heard of the process called focus stacking. I was trying to do focus stacking with macro photography because when you shoot at those high magnifications, you've got depths of field that are like paper thin. And so I was shooting 100 pictures on a tripod of a mosquito, focus stacked them all to get hyper sharp images of that mosquito. But I did it with a 50 millimeter macro lens with extension tubes on it. And I was probably that far away from the mosquito taking pictures of it. And I got like 4 times life size of the mosquito. So, but I couldn't have done that with the simple macro, but those extension tubes, if you don't have any, they're really, 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 they're really powerful. Kyle said, you're exactly right, Kyle. That was from earlier when I was talking about, I couldn't remember the name of the town where the National Bison Refuge is. It's between Missoula and, I said, I can't remember the name of the town, but Flathead Lake, it is Polson, Montana. So thank you for that. And then Christine asked the question, do you also stay within standard proportions, or do you ever crop the actual output size as a way to create a better composition? I usually try to stay within the proportional standards of the picture, Christine. And the reason why I do that is for a couple of reasons. One is I'm just kind of old school. I like to work with what I've got. You know, these newer cameras, mirrorless in particular, you can mimic it on the DSLRs, but mirrorless will do it natively for you. You can change the image ratio, 4:3, 16:9. I know my Canon R5 has, I think, 4 or 5 different crop ratios that you can change in the camera. Usually I like the 4:4:30 or the 4:3 ratio, like comes native on these cameras. If I ever really crop at all, it's because I crop. One of the things I didn't include on this because it's an overused term, but I will talk about it in a minute. If I do crop anything, it's because I wasn't paying attention to the edges, and I let a limb or something kind of creep into the edge where I may crop. If I can't blot it out easy using the heel tool, may just crop it a little bit to help improve the composition. So thank y'all for those questions on the chat. So this is kind of a departure for me because usually I don't talk about taking pictures of people, but one of the things I do a lot are take pictures of people, particularly for my, when I used to do a lot more commercial work, it was almost always people. Or when I still do some commercial work, mainly in the agriculture industry, but when I shoot magazine stories, I still take pictures of a lot of people doing the things they do for whatever that particular story is. And I know a lot of people I deal with have grandkids that they love taking pictures of, and or family members they love taking pictures of. So on this talk, I wanted to include a couple of people pictures to really accentuate some of the lessons I'm talking about. And that cute little boy there holding a pumpkin, this picture was actually shot for magazine story about pumpkin farming in Texas. A lot of you may or may not know, or you may not even care to know, but in the Texas Panhandle, in a county called Floyd County, the name of the town is called Floydada. It's the pumpkin capital of Texas. So if you're in North Texas and you go to Dallas to buy pumpkins, almost every pumpkin that they sell at stores all came from that, that half of a county out in the southern, out on the southern plains in Texas. And so when I did this shoot, I'm always an advocate of homemade models because they work cheap. And so I took my two kids to be models for me. And this is actually my son, and that cute little boy is about to graduate high school now. But as we talk about this, you can actually see two pieces of the rule of thirds in play. And number one is the top line, the top horizontal line of the tic-tac-toe grid goes right through his eyeballs, because that's what we tend to look at first, are people's eyes. And then I even try to position myself thinking about the horizon. And so the horizon line is actually towards the lower third of the picture. And that was on purpose. And because that, when you're taking pictures of people, that's dictated by how high you are in relation to the person. If I was standing at my full height, I'd be looking down on him, and it's hard to get the horizon in that particular location. But I got at a lower angle, and the reason, and you can tell that because you can see this out of focus vegetation in the foreground. And I took a couple of compositions of this one. I gave historically, and it's not historically, from a practical matter, you'd want to give them a little room to breathe. So I might move them over here to the right side of the frame. And then let me get my drawing stuff back up. I might want to move him over here to the right side of the frame and then have more space on this left side. But when I shot this picture, I had my business mind was going. So I was thinking of a magazine cover, and from a magazine cover standpoint, one of the thing, and that drives a lot of my compositions as well, or how it's going to look on a magazine page. And from a magazine cover standpoint, you can tell you got this space up here that they would include the title of the magazine. And then you got this space here, sort of negative space, sort of reverse composition. I'm going to show you some examples in a minute where the rule of thirds sort of goes out the window. And then you've still got a little bit of room here and down here where you can put some more words. So that's what guided that compositional choice there, of why I stuck him, his shape right in the middle, but his eyes are at the top rule of third and the horizon's at the bottom rule of third. And I say this, and it sounds like a lot to remember when I talk through it, but over time, if you remember the rule of thirds and those shapes, it really does start becoming muscle memory, and you start doing it without really even thinking about it. And then another picture, this is for a shoot for another magazine. This was actually the cover of the magazine too. And sort of the same thing. This young man was a senior in college at the time. I think I took this picture probably about 5 years ago. I still keep in contact with him. His name is Taryn Moore. He's an insurance agent in East Texas now, but he was about to graduate college, but he had a real successful produce farm in East Texas. And so the magazine was doing a story about him and how remarkable, how young he was, and was able to find that kind of success so early on in really a niche agriculture. But when I took this picture, this was all by design because, again, we're putting the name of the magazine cover there. So that guided my composition. And that part, most of y'all, unless you have aspirations to shoot for magazines, may not come in handy. But just the way he starts standing and you start looking, you've got the reason why I had him hold the basket like he did. You've got a natural triangle right there. And so that helps. The elbows help draw your eyes from the basket up to his face. And that all of that is intentional. And it's just thinking through it and, using the most important tool in your camera bag. And that's your noggin, and thinking about all those things whenever you try to take a picture. Oops, hang on a second. I didn't delete. And then by now it should be obvious to you. It should be obvious to you of the design elements. You can see the triangle there, rule of thirds. It's just it all sort of starts playing in there over time, and you can really tell sort of how things look. So you can see the sun is roughly at the upper rule of thirds, and it's counterbalanced by the triangle at the bottom that I used on the rock and put the horizon line up there. Because again, the most interesting part of this picture was all in the foreground. Least interesting part was the sky. And so it's really just sort of a balance most of the time. Am I going to put the sky at the upper third of the picture or the sky at the lower third of the picture? And that's really dictated by how interesting the sky is and how interesting the foreground is. And then get back to where I was. This is a shot of a white-tailed deer. I've taken thousands of pictures of white-tailed deer, and for some reason, this is among my favorite. And I don't know what it is. I mean, first, it's an impressive deer. That's one thing. But secondarily, I just like the soft light. I like the out of focus areas. I like everything about it. But one of the things people struggle with too, and this is my thinking, is, you know, I keep saying, give the animal room to breathe, or give the scene room to breathe. And obviously the room to breathe for this one is out in this area. But why didn't I put it on the other side? Why didn't the deer on the right side of the picture as opposed to the left side? Well, that was kind of dictated by which way the deer was leaning. And so we talked about earlier, if an animal's walking into the scene, you give it more space in front of where it's walking. Well, this deer was facing me, but he was leaning over to try to check out what I was doing. And because of the way he leaned, that's which way I decided to give him a little more space into. And so it's just all about kind of conveying that movement and not crowding the animal, and just giving the picture and the subject kind of room to breathe around it. I always like this. Every time I show this picture of this dolphin, it's just, I'll be honest with everybody, it's me taking a victory lap. I think I won the world with my dolphin picture on this one right here. I think it's a really, in my opinion, really, really nice picture. It happened because I chose the worst seat in the boat, and it happened to be where the dolphin was jumping, and all the pieces clicked together for this. But even in the moment, and it just had a couple of seconds to work with it, you can still see the rule of thirds. I defaulted to the rule of thirds to try to compose this picture. And it's everything. And again, when this happened, the dolphin jumped behind us for about 30 seconds, but you just don't know if you've ever seen this before, when dolphins get behind boats and jump in the wake, it's amazing to watch. And I jokingly told the people on the boat with me that day, if that doesn't put a smile on your face, you've got to be dead inside to see that and not smile about it, because it's just such a magical scene to see. But it happens quick and it happens unpredictably. And when it happened, from muscle memory, and I talk about that concept a lot because it's true. If you play golf, when you grab a golf club, you grab it the same way every time because it's muscle memory. When you almost every activity you do, if you do it repetitive enough, becomes muscle memory. Well, in photography, the muscle memory for me is automatically trying to see the elements of the scene and line it up into the rule of thirds. And so and if we can draw, and it's not, again, not perfect, but if we draw a rough rule of thirds, it kind of runs about right there. And if I had it to do over again, I probably would have given the animal a little more room to breathe on the right hand side. But I didn't. I more center punched him. But I think if I'm forgiving myself on this one, I think that sun sort of helps counterbalance out the fact that the dolphin's right in the middle of the scene. If without the sun, I don't think it's a strong image. But with the sun, all of a sudden you got that diagonal line, and you add that diagonal line to it. What do you have on each side? 2 triangles. And so again, that was an automatic picture that I wasn't thinking about triangles when I shot it. But it just so happened, because I defaulted to that rule of thirds, ended up getting a pretty nice shot of this dolphin jumping. This is another picture. So I've got 2 compositions of this, and this is me again thinking magazine cover, because that's the finest example of an elk I've ever seen in my life. It's just a monster beast, one of the biggest specimens that, the biggest specimen I've ever seen, and I would argue one of the biggest specimen most people will ever see. And it was so beautiful. So I took two compositions. I took one horizontal, I say two compositions. Well, I took more than two pictures, but I took two basic compositions. One as a horizontal, and this is me thinking about magazine covers because of the size of the animal. I'm thinking, well, maybe I can get this on a magazine cover one day. I haven't got it yet, but of course you can see sort of the, you put the words all up there. Now, even though the animal is moving to the right, he's looking to the left. And so all of my horizontal pictures have more space to the left. And this is an example where you have to think about it a little bit, and it breaks the rule a little bit, because we always hear that that the animals, you give the animal more space in the direction it's moving, but because this animal was moving to the right, turned around and looked to the left and bugled at some cows, it was more appropriate in my horizontal pictures to put it there. And the reason why I didn't show you the horizontal pictures is because I think there's one more lesson to learn from the vertical, in that if I was to do this picture over again, I probably would have cropped a little bit of this space out and gave it a little more room on this side to breathe. I think it would have been improved the composition a little bit. Now, this is a high enough megapixel file that I could go back and crop it, but I think we learn lessons in our mistakes that we make, or our shortcomings. And I didn't want to make you think that every picture is just compositionally perfect. This is one where I could have done better. And again, I can make it better by cropping it. I try not to crop because I paid a lot of money for those cameras that I buy. And so I like to try to use every megapixel I paid for when I take the pictures. So I always default to cropping very last. But again, this is a good example of where I could have done it better. And all of these could be improved to some degree. These are just some of my favorites, and why I think they work. And this gets into our kind of our last spot about where it's okay to break the rules. And this is I did a shoot for a crop dusting company one time, and we were trying to imagine all kinds of innovative ways to take pictures of crop dusters, because the easy thing to do is be on the ground and take pictures of them flying over it. But that kind of lacks a certain sort of pizzazz that you want to have in a picture. And so I opted for this one, and we put GoPros and fired them remotely on the wings of the camera. And when I was trying to line up the composition before the plane took off, that was kind of my thing, because this breaks the rules. If I keep talking about space and giving the animal or giving the subject space to breathe in, but if we oops, hang on one second, I've got something in the way on my screen. If we talk about space, it would seem logical that you would have more space out to the front of the plane, because that's the way the plane was moving. But in my thinking, the reason why I chose this at the time was it's pretty obvious what we're taking a picture of. And so the plane, actually, this is a case where the plane is not the star of the show. It's what the plane is doing is the star of the show. And what it does is to accentuate, because again, this is for an aerial application company. And so because of the star of the show was more what the plane was doing is spraying out. By the way, we were spraying water on this shoot that day, because water gives the same effect of any kind of fertilizer or chemical they may spray. But to give the effect, and since the liquid, what it's spraying as the star of the show, I chose to give it more space at the back. But other than that, this still kind of covers all the rough sort of, oops, I did something there, made my screen a lot smaller. It sort of covers all the rough compositional elements of the rule of thirds. And then, that's one of those pictures that I had time to think about. And as I thought about it, that's the composition I came up with. Because we debated, well, we thought, to wade into the weeds a little bit, thought about this picture a while for a couple of reasons. One, compositional wise, what was going to give the most impact in the picture. And so where are we going to put the camera, which way we're going to point the cameras. And this is what I thought what worked best for the shot. And really the other reason is, these are $1 million airplanes, and you don't want a camera falling off of them. I didn't want to lose my camera, but you don't want a camera falling off and bouncing across. And even though it would have been unusual to happen, get something caught up in a propeller and cause the pilot and the plane any danger at all. So all of that went into just one simple picture that of the shoot we did. I think it was among the most effective pictures that we did for that. And this is another one that's kind of if you've watched many webinars, I've used this as a background picture a lot because this is probably my favorite hummingbird picture I've ever taken. I'm not a huge hummingbird photographer, and but I've started trying to become one because I get a lot of hummingbirds on this place. But even this one's kind of a little bit of and I played with this one in real time to try to see what looks the best, and this ended up being my favorite. And that is, if you think about the rule of thirds, it kind of pretty much follows the rule of thirds. That's my starting point all the time. You can see the triangle even in there. This is the triangle, and I actually put this perch in place. What you can't see off to the left here is a feeder, hummingbird feeder that they perch on before they go feed. So that stick is there for a reason because I like that triangle shape. But when I was looking at this bird in the camera and trying to figure out what looks best from a conventional wisdom, he's kind of leaning over to the right. So you'd think you'd include more space that way. But this is, again, where you break the rules because he kept doing his wing like that and just sort of stretching one wing out. I thought it looked better to kind of give him more space in the direction that he's pointing in. So I think that composition looks better. But that's why in the beginning, I talked about rules with it in quotation, because they are rules, but they're not really rules. They're more, it ought to be called, instead of rule of thirds, it ought to be called the guideline of thirds, because that's sort of the way I look at it. Is it's always made to be broken. And it's one of those things that it's sometimes hard to articulate what's going to look good, but I promise you, when you do it enough, you'll know it when you see it. And I know people that are listening tonight can absolutely tell you when that moment begins. Leslie asked a question on chat, and you'll have to remind me, Leslie, what picture you're talking about. They asked if I knew what f-stop I used for a picture, so I'm not sure. That question slipped past me before I saw it. So if you'll remind me what picture you were referring to, I'll be happy to tell you that. And this is another place. This is more sort of the Instagram composition. And I do this a lot when I'm showing details, where I don't mind putting a subject like this sort of front and center and sort of in breaking those rule of thirds rules. This is from the shoot of the young man for the cover of the magazine that was the produce farmer. These are some of the things he grew in his hands. These black-eyed peas are in his hands. And so this sort of breaks the rules on composition that I put it right in the middle. But if you pay attention to, you start seeing a shape emerge. Can you maybe tell me what that shape is? And that was on purpose too, on the picture. I think this picture ended up being a double page spread. And that shape is, it's got a triangle. Oops, it's got a triangle right there. And that's what, your eyes leading there. And from there, you kind of go up to his arms, and context tells a lot to the story. And so that's what kind of guided me to doing that composition. And this is one of those stock pictures that I do a lot whenever I'm shooting. I talk a lot about whenever I'm shooting a story for a magazine. On my workshops, I'll try to encourage people it's easy to go to the Tetons and get enamored with the mountains and shoot nothing but mountain pictures. But if you're telling the story of the Tetons, there's a lot more to that than just those big mountains in the background. There's the vegetation that surrounds it. There's all good stories are made up of details. So I encourage people to look for details in whatever you're shooting pictures of. And this just happened to be one of those detail shots. So Leslie got back with me, and their question was, what's the f-stop? And it's the one with the elk in the background. It's really soft background. Let me find it. I think I went past it, but I'll get back to it. There we go. If this is the one you're talking about here, and I think it is, because I think I only had 2 elk shots in this presentation. This was likely shot, and I know this because I almost always shoot at this. This was likely probably shot at f5.6. I don't know if we've got a delay, but I think this is the one you're talking about, Leslie. I just got a message from Leslie. But this shot here was likely shot at f5.6, just because. And most of these wildlife shots are shot at f5.6 because I can tell you these were shot with my 500mm lens. I've got a 500mm f4 lens that I'll put a teleconverter on, and which makes it a 7, I'm not doing the math, 740 f5.6. And so I usually just default to that when I'm shooting these wildlife pictures because I like the way the backgrounds look in these wildlife shots, really out of focus. Even with this hummingbird here, it was shot, that was a combination. We talked about extension tubes earlier. My 500mm lens with the 1.4 extender would get me close, but when you're talking about a hummingbird that's that big, it wouldn't get me close enough. And so to solve that problem of close focusing, I put my extension tubes on my 500mm lens. And then instead of it being able to focus 15 feet away, I was able to get 5 or 6 feet away from this bird and photograph it bigger than life size, like you see here, and really get a nice picture of it. And then because I know I probably shot this at f5.6, it gives you the background like you see there, just really out of focus background. And that's the way I kind of like doing things. And I think that's my last, well, I know that's my last slide because it's my stay in touch slide with my email address. Does anybody have any questions about anything? And by the way, if you're wondering, Don, I am going to go get a beard trim tomorrow because I'm looking, it's been a while since I've been to town and got a beard trim. So I've got to go get one tomorrow. So I at least look halfway civilized for my next trip that I go on. Does anybody have any questions at all on anything? I hope this enlightened y'all a little bit, kind of the, you know, it's sort of the sausage making part of the process. It's again, I don't, you know, I try to make it sound easy because it is easy, because it's just a simple wash, rinse, and repeat. Once you see it, and once you start kind of seeing those shapes and you remember to do it each time, remember to do the rule of thirds each time, it starts making finding those pictures a lot easier. You know, one of the things I talk about a lot is everybody, and me included, and because when I was first getting started in photography, no matter where you're at in your journey, I remember that it was always, I could get where I could take a good picture every now and then, but I wasn't consistent. And so the consistency is the hardest thing to build in photography. And so I learned over time to be consistent. It all came back to just some basic fundamentals, and it's kind of a 1, 2, 3 step process. It's wash, rinse, repeat every time. It's figuring out those, no matter the genre of photography you like, it's figuring out what you're doing right and just repeating those simple steps every time. And I know that sounds really, really simplistic, but it really is that simple. You can watch a million videos of people making it complicated, but it all comes back to, I love baseball. And, you know, the great hitters like Ted Williams and Wade Boggs and all the great hitters of our time, they didn't think about their mechanics when they did it. It just became muscle memory and it became instinct over time. And it was simply for them doing the same thing over and over and over again. And that's the way I look at doing photography and really deconstructing compositions is over time, if you do it enough, it just becomes second nature to you. So I encourage you to stay in touch. There's my email address, russell@russellgraves.com. As almost anyone that has communicated will tell you, I always answer emails. Sometimes I may be a day or two late in answering them, but I'll always get back to you. And so if you have any questions or comments or just want to say hi, or if you're ever passing through the area of North Texas and want to stop in and say hi, feel free to reach out to me. I love talking photography, and I appreciate everyone showing up tonight. And I think that's my last one. So I appreciate it. Again, if anybody has any questions, I'll hang around for a couple of seconds. By the way, a little bit of house cleaning. I did record this because I've been watching it the whole time recording. And when we're done, probably tomorrow, I will send out the re-recording. If you might have missed something or you want to rewatch it just to kind of bone up on some of the things we talked about. And so you'll be getting that via email tomorrow. The people who signed up for the webinar, I'll get first crack at it, and then I'll release it on my YouTube channel in a day or two after that. So again, if you have any questions, speak up now. I'm looking at a bunch of chats. Let me look back. I'll answer some of those right quick. Let me Thank you, Carol, for there are a lot of people saying thank you. Appreciate all of that. Oh, Leo told me that the closed captioning does an amazing job. So the AI, our AI overlords are about to take over if they can understand my accent. Hey, Stan, I just saw you there. How you doing, buddy? Stan speaks a foreign language. He speaks Canadian.
It's not that foreign.
Stan, I'm gonna brag on Stan. Stan's a great dude, and he's a good wood carver. He graciously sent me a big wood carving and of a salmon. We saw one in Alaska like that. We're in a trip on Alaska together, and he graciously carved me one and sent it to me. So that's hanging in a place of honor, Stan. So I tell people about that thing all the time. Appreciate it. John, appreciate that. What you said, let's see. Adele asked, what was the question where the answer was Polson? I couldn't remember the name of the town that the bison range in Montana was close to. And someone answered that the town is Polson. I can't remember who that was, but I appreciate that answer. And then Nora says the idea of giving more breathing room will improve things for me. Appreciate that. Glad that was helpful to you. And then Charlo, yeah, that's the correct town. That's the one that's closest, the little bitty town. Thank you.
Polson's an hour and a half away from.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Charlo's the little town right by there.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's where the little lodge is and all that, correct?
Well, I don't know if you stayed there. There's not much to eat there, but right up there is, you probably were off of 93, just east of Charlo.
If you go out the gate and go left is Charlo.
Correct.
Yep, that's right. See, we have a well-traveled crowd, which
No, I live there.
Yeah,
I live in
I was
Montana.
gonna say Adele lives, I didn't want to say that, but Adele lives in Montana, so she
Yeah.
knows all about Montana. Good to hear from you, Adele.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Well, thanks
Great
everybody.
presentation.
Oh, appreciate it. Thanks. I hope you found it helpful. And like I said, stay in touch and we'll see everyone around soon. Appreciate it. Thank y'all.
Thanks much.
Bye.